Hey guys, it's the stick figure historian again. Although, I don't know why I'm telling you that since you just clicked on the video and you already know it's me. But anyway, welcome back to the England series. I last told you of how King Charles became the voluntary prisoner of the Scottish army. But this was only the first step in a convoluted mess that would follow over roughly the next year and a half. This is the story of how a king could be a prisoner 3 times over. Charles spent the May of 1646 to January of 1647 in the English town of Newcastle upon Tyne. The Scots spent the long months educating him about Presbyterianism and trying to get him to make some sort of compromise, to at least try out their solemn league and covenant for a few years. The king responded very cordially to all this, pretending interest and making suggestions. But no matter how smoothly he put it, at the end of it all, the answer was always no. Of course, the Scots had also been keeping in contact with Parliament all this time as well, who was very eager to have the king in their control. Until now, the Scots had rejected all consideration of giving Charles over to them, but after months of going around and around with the king and getting nowhere, their patience had run quite thin. At last, a contract was drawn up. In return for £100,000, more than $20 million in the United States today, along with even more money to be paid over time, the Scots gave their king over to his enemies. Yes, in fact, they sold him. It was a terrible thing to do, but we can't exactly feel sorry for Charles. He hadn't truly ever cared for his people, English or Scottish, so he had little right to expect loyalty from them. The king's second prison was in Northamptonshire. Though when I say prison, I don't mean a prison like you might be thinking of. Charles wasn't chained up in a little cold room with iron bars, mice, or anything nasty like that. He was kept in Holdenby House, a great, beautiful mansion in the quiet rolling hills of the countryside. One might logically conclude that the war was over now, and that Parliament could rule in peace. But this would be faulty. The shooting and killing had stopped, but the fighting was far from over. It flared up now amongst the Roundheads themselves. It would seem that the monster Parliament had created, this great invincible new model army, had grown too large and strong to be controlled. You see, the men in Parliament were largely what we might call conservative, meaning they wanted to keep most of the old ways of governing England and only change a few things. For instance, they still wanted to give priests and bishops lots of power, no matter if they were Anglican or Presbyterian. They wanted only to allow rich people with lots of land to vote for members of Parliament, and they wanted to punish anyone who believed differently from the accepted state religion. But most of the officers in the army, like Oliver Cromwell, were called independents, basically meaning that they weren't Anglican, and they wanted a lot more freedom for the people. Now, this doesn't mean complete freedom. They also believed in persecuting people who didn't agree with them, people like Catholics. But unlike the conservatives, they wanted to take power away from the bishops, let almost everyone have a chance to vote, and get rid of debtor's prison, among other things that would make life better for people. The conflict of ideas between the army and Parliament had been tolerable whilst there was the business of warring to attend to, since it kept the soldiers busy and distracted enough. But now the war was over, and there were thousands of men with weapons, who had nothing to do. Men who very strongly disagreed with how Parliament wanted to govern their country. And frankly, Parliament was afraid. They couldn't fight the monster they had created in a head-on battle, so they contrived a means of a slower, quieter death. They would simply send all the soldiers home, or else ship them off to Ireland to keep down the unrest that was always brewing there. One problem with this. The soldiers hadn't been paid for weeks. Parliament was now telling men who had worked for them for years, suffering hardships and miseries, spending time away from their families, risking their very lives, to go home or to a foreign land without even being properly paid for it. And all only to be ruled by a power nearly as tyrannical as the king they had just fought so hard to depose? This was not going to happen. It didn't take the officers of the new model army much thinking to realize that they had the upper hand. It was a simple matter of physics. They had the guns, Parliament didn't. It was time to take charge. A cornet named George Joyce went to visit Cromwell at his house on Drury Lane in London. Wait, Drury Lane? Does that mean Cromwell was the Muffin Man?
Oh, do you know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man? Do you know the Muffin Man who lives on Drury Lane? Yes, I know the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man, the Muffin Man. Yes, I know the Muffin Man who lives on Drury
Lane. Sorry. Cromwell really did have a house on Drury Lane, though. But he didn't make muffins. At least that I know. Anyway, the point is, George Joyce went to visit Cromwell. He had an idea that he wanted to discuss with the general. It wasn't a complicated idea, but it was a powerful one nonetheless. Joyce wanted to take the king away from Parliament. Cromwell was quite pleased with the plan, and gave him permission to take 500 men to execute it. Joyce wasted no time. He gathered his little division and marched straight to Holdenby House. The colonel who was in charge of watching over Charles was informed of Joyce's approach. This man was no stranger to the current restive politics of London, and he could pretty much guess what Joyce's intentions were. But, being not of the braver sort, the colonel fled from his post at the last moment, allowing the triumphant cornet access to the captive king. It was the middle of the night when Joyce came barging through the door into the king's bedroom, a loaded pistol in his hand. "You are under arrest in the name of the new model army," he informed him gruffly. "Prepare to leave with me in the morning." Whether Charles was surprised at this or not, we do not know. Surely he must have heard before that Joyce was coming. The king had his wits about him, whatever the case, for he asked the cornet by what authority he thought to arrest him. Joyce stepped aside, showing the 500 men who stood in the doorway just behind him. He jerked his hand back toward them, then turned around and left. Though Joyce said nothing, the message was clear to Charles. The authority was in strength of arms. For the king to resist was useless. He was taken to Newmarket the next morning, a prisoner thrice over.